Cool. It's funny, a lot of times what happens on podcasting is we start to talk about a little bit what we're going to talk about, and then we end up starting to say stuff that I'm like, this is just good for the daggone podcast, so let's start all over and hit record. But I kind of gave you guys, because we're recording a handful of stuff that will spread out throughout some weeks, and I wanted to give you both a heads up of some of the stuff that we'll be talking about so you can think a little bit about. And one thing that I wanted to talk about was just entertainment, and kind of from a, I guess, morality standpoint, not just Christian, but just, you know, people that are trying to do the right thing and be moral people and you know, conscious of humanity and lover of creation and all that kind of stuff. Well, I was thinking about movies because I actually circled back. I hadn't seen the whole Saw series. I think I saw like the first two, and then just recently I watched the third one. I'm like, why am I watching such intense crazy and it is crazy with age. I actually can't handle it. I was surprised how many times I turned my head, and not from a moral I'm not going to watch this, but I cannot handle seeing what is happening to these people. And then I saw Midsommar over who directs it, Natalie?
Ari Aster.
Okay, and he also directed Hereditary, which
Yes.
in my opinion is the absolute freakiest movie I've ever seen in my whole entire life, and I don't think there'll ever be one to top it. And I say I really did enjoy it. So I was watching Midsommar, and so Natalie, when before we hit record, and I said let's just start from zero and run this back, sort of thing. You said just the fact that you mentioned Saw and Midsommar in this opening means you don't understand Midsommar. And I think the reason...
That's how I felt when I heard about it.
Right. And so I think the reason why I connected the two is the sort of violence that both movies show. There is an option on the table to imply the violence and not necessarily show it. Like there are things that both movies could have easily gotten across. You know exactly what happened.
Yep.
You know exactly what happened to their body parts, but you did not see them in a very grotesque, intense manner. I have to say, and I'm sure I will go on the record to say, if you are sensitive about movies, if you're kind of maybe in a more legalistic season of your life, do not watch Midsommar. Just don't watch it.
Let's have this conversation about Midsommar.
Yeah, I actually loved the movie. I was so intrigued. Now, there was some very crazy sexual stuff that just my personal deal. I turned my head because I don't want those images in my head. But it was a very interesting movie that, for me, what makes a really good movie is you don't want it to be over. And when it is over, you're like, I thought that movie just began. And that's kind of how I felt about Midsommar. But it was very unsettling, very freaky, very spooky, but I thought it was very wonderful. But that's my main thing is, and so we're going to get into these movies for sure. But let me start here. You guys, neither one of y'all would sign up to watch real footage of kids being tortured for an hour.
Definitely not.
Okay,
yeah, hard pass.
So for sure, y'all be like, I'm not going to watch kids really being tortured for an hour. All right, would you watch like basically a movie that from start to finish is just kids being tortured? Probably not.
No.
Even if it's just a movie, not if there's no point or anything. So at what point does Saul, if people haven't seen that, there is some sort of depth there that the guy that's doing this crazy stuff to people, he's actually circling in on stuff that they are really messed up in and kind of teaching them a lesson. Like there's depth there. Midsommar to me is even deeper. I mean, Natalie, you're about to die here, so dig in.
I'm trying so hard to relax and use my words and choose them wisely. So, quick back on my experience with Saw.
Yeah.
I saw Saw 1 and Saw 3. I saw Saw and Saw 3.
Yeah.
I really like Saw because it's very much like a like a thriller detective mystery type thing that features horror and body horror. The rest of the Saw series is notoriously referred to as torture porn.
Really?
Yes. Because a lot of it they feel like is gratuitous, and because they feel like it's unnecessary. And it's
agree?
like,
do you agree?
I think that like later as the Saw series continued, it definitely became like a what's the grossest thing we can show on the screen? You know what I mean? And like it lost its way. That's how I feel about it. But I watch a lot of horror movies with a lot of body horror, and I love the special effects that can go into things like that. Like I live for that stuff.
John, do you even like this kind of stuff, by the way, real quick?
Yeah, I do. I don't get the opportunity to watch a lot of it because it's a hard
kids.
Pass. Well, not just kids, but like Emily is not gonna sit and watch
Oh
that.
yeah,
with me.
that's fair.
It's not her cup of tea for sure.
All right, go ahead, Natalie. Sorry.
You're good. Let's talk about Midsommar.
Yeah.
So, first of all, let's talk about Ari Aster. Ari Aster is this writer-director who like came on the horror scene, and so many people were like taken aback by Hereditary that like they thought it was the coolest thing ever. It's super fresh. It's very different. Not only like story-wise, but like visually.
Natalie, there are literally times when I paused it and I looked at my brother and I was like, oh my gosh. And then I would turn my head back to the TV and hit play. There's no other movie where I pause just to say, oh my gosh.
He's brilliant, and he has a beautiful eye for things, and his storytelling is great, in my opinion. When I saw Midsommar, actually, I thought of our friend Maggie.
Yeah.
For a lot of reasons. But I called her to get her opinion on it and like riff on it or whatever and like talk about it. And I also thought of Priscilla, because I think y'all have like roots in that part of the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah. What was it? Midwest?
No. When they go like Scandinavian roots. Or whatever.
Yeah.
So I thought about y'all.
Yeah.
But it's absolutely beautiful. It's a very fun way to play with that kind of lore.
Yeah.
To me, that is a movie in a different caliber than Saw. Saw was a regular movie that became a sensation because of its notoriety with like how disgusting it could be.
Yeah.
Midsommar is a movie that became like, or really Ari Aster is a person who became sensational because of his talent.
Right.
And because of his like love for the craft, right? Like the art that's in both Hereditary and Midsommar, the way that both of them like use lighting, and like that idea of like the way he elevates film in the horror genre, it's very refreshing.
Yeah.
So to me, they're two very different things. Can Midsommar be gratuitous with its like imagery? Yes. But I think in the same way that Hereditary did it, like they do it for the shock to an extent, but a lot of it has a play in the story, right? Because like you're not the only person seeing this; the people in the story are also seeing it, and there are real repercussions in the story for these people who are seeing these awful things happening, right? It's not just happening for you, the viewer, and then that's where it ends, which is what I think Saw is for a good chunk of time. Like there are repercussions of it, but I think that they're very shallow, as opposed to like.
Yeah. So let me make a case for these movies and see what y'all think about this or Midsommar. There are cults, and there are cults that have a very this is probably archaic for me to say satanic. There's probably better ways of saying it, but just very evil depth to these cults where these sorts of things in Midsommar, where people are sacrificed and those sorts of things do indeed happen. So let's take Saving Private Ryan, which was an extremely violent movie that depicted the real violence in World War II, where, soldiers fought on behalf of America to keep us from being run by tyranny and, potentially killed, all of us. I don't know what would have happened if we would have lost that war. So Midsommar, even though a fictitious storyline, still represents true stuff. So if I say, man, couldn't Midsommar have just suggested some of this violence and not shown it? You could turn right back around and say, well, why didn't Saving Private Ryan do the same thing? We didn't need to know that someone's arm was blown off and he, turns back around and picks up his arm and carry it. We didn't need to see that.
But the gravity of it, though, it serves to, like, push that, like, that desperateness, that gravity of that situation because of how graphic it is. And which serves my point of, like, when you look at something like Saw, it's in such a small container that I feel like it doesn't have... it's just gross.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But you look at something like Midsommar and or Saving Private Ryan that I feel uses it as like a true story point, and it has more depth. There's a reason to it, because like not showing that or cutting away from it, you'd understand that it was a serious thing, but it would not disturb you as much as actually seeing it would. And then at that point, you sympathize so much more with those characters because you are actually seeing what's happening.
That makes sense. John, what do you think about all this?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say really what it all boils down to for me is like what is art and what is not art.
Yeah.
Or what is art and what is cheap art. And
yes.
And it's I think it's different for everybody, for sure.
And that's crazy too, because think of Kill Bill. There's some art to it, but then some people could say that's cheap art. I mean, what the heck? You know what I'm saying? I mean,
it's fire.
But there's Kill Bill's fire. There's
fire.
There's context to Kill Bill, right? So there's
an artistic quality to it.
There's an artist, and it was his homage, right, to those
samurai movies, to 70s movies.
Exactly. Yeah. So like understanding all of those nuance is at the heart, I think, of this conversation, and like. Yeah. There's a nuanced way to show those things and to disturb people. What we don't find in Saw and movies like them is that nuance. It's just in your face. It feels cheap because it is cheap. It's not thought through.
I like that.
It's and again, a lot of people love Saw. That's why they made 18 of them. So like I'm not here to like poo-poo on what people like and what they don't like. I think that's again what the heart of like what is art and what is not art, and what to me is artistic and can be beautiful or scary or disturbing is different than my next door neighbor, I'm sure. So it's tough to say. At your original question, I think was like, where does it go? Can it go too far? And like, is there a point in which we're showing violence just for violence sake? And I think the answer is yes. I don't know that that's necessarily a morality question, though. For me, it comes down to it just makes a bad movie. It just it's like the classic thing on Church and Other Drugs. Jed and I fight all the time about the John Wick movies. Right, because I think that I hate them so much.
Because you hate Keanu Reeves because you're wrong.
I hate Keanu Reeves. He's a horrible actor. He might be a great human being, but he's an awful actor. And all John Wick is gunfights for like 2 hours. It's all it is a gunfight. A dude got mad because they killed his dog, and he gets in a gunfight for 2 hours. It's cheap. It's shallow. There's no nuance.
It's perfectly cheap. It's perfectly shallow because it is an exercise in stuntmen. And it's wonderful because of that.
Sure.
It's funny you said perfectly cheap. Priscilla does not like going to restaurants like this, Chinese buffets, and in college, we just love going to China. I mean, as a kid, it's just glorious. And I took my kids into a Chinese buffet, and it was the lowest grade, disgusting environment, glorious food I've ever eaten. Oh my gosh.
Only eat the fried food because you don't trust anything else, but I'm 100% here for it.
The egg rolls, the sweet and sour chicken.
100% here for it.
So with these movies, one thing that I'm hearing is it sounds like both of y'all are saying that there is merit in disturbing people. Like there's
Oh,
times
Yeah,
when
it depends
people,
on what your goal is, but yeah.
yeah,
For
yeah.
sure. And there's
I think
art
so.
there's art in art galleries that disturbs people. There's
Yeah.
performance art
100%.
that disturbs people, and there's to get a point across, right? And
Yeah.
whatever that might
Music
be.
too.
Music too, for sure. So yeah, I think that there's true artistic value to disturbing people.
Yeah, yeah. All right. We're gonna go into this interview here in a second, but y'all listen to this. So this guy is, and it's been maybe a month since I interviewed him, but he has a very good. I joke around and call him the atheism slayer, but it's because he's super smart and he's actually Jewish and he has a really, really good case for God. But he was telling me about this huge success that he's had in banking, and I actually researched Scott Shay. This is the guy that you're going to hear an interview of, and listen to this. Scott Shay has served as a founder and is chairman of the board of directors, so founder of Signature Bank since its inception. Signature Bank has grown to over $15 billion in assets since its founding 11 years ago, and is the top performing bank in the U.S. in shareholder returns since its IPO. I think I interviewed a billionaire and did not even know it.
Jeez.
That's awesome. That's too funny.
Oof.
Funny stuff.
Oh, money.
Maybe he'll be a patron. All right, well, we are here with Scott Shay, and we're continuing a trend that this podcast has always done. That I don't just have people on here that are smarter than me. I have people on here that are way smarter than me. So, Scott, thanks for being on here. You've got quite a rap sheet with economics and stuff. Like you're a money guy. It looks like you co-founded a bank. Tell us about that background.
Sure. So I did do a lot in sort of the money arena, and I have done, and I still do. I started a bank with two partners. We started with $42.5 million in capital. We opened our doors. We had a $50 million balance sheet. And today we are a $50 billion bank.
Wow.
No acquisitions, all by getting clients to come in the door one at a time. And we're pretty proud of that. We're also very proud of the fact that we're the only bank in the United States of America above $4 billion in assets that had no down year during the financial crisis.
Dang.
Every year we did better than the prior year. So we didn't invest in CDOs and CDOs squared and subprime mortgages. We actually did a really unusual thing. We just stuck with our clients.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. You've already used a couple of terms. I don't even know what you're talking about, but it sounds like y'all were smart and y'all were ahead of the game and had some good planning. So is thinking about faith and you wrote a book called In Good Faith, and that's why we have you on here. Would you call that more of like a hobby, something that you do for fun, something that's interesting, and so you read up on a bunch of stuff and you write stuff? Is it a hobby?
Yes, you would say so. Look, I'm one of those people that really believes in being a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
And I think that God and faith and all of that is something that I take very seriously. And I think a lot of people do. But that doesn't mean I don't have a day job.
Right.
So I'm very grateful for my day job. And I think to a certain degree, faith and ethics are entwined in the business world for good and for bad, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, let's just jump right in this. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to read a little blurb. I don't know if I got it from Amazon or from the email that I was sent, but it says, this book explores the most common atheist critiques of the Bible and religion, incorporating Jewish, Christian, and Muslim voices. The result is a fresh, modern reevaluation of religion and of atheism. that just sounds really cool how Muslim is included in that. Now, I'm assuming you're a Christian, correct?
I'm Jewish.
Jewish, okay. So, like, from a Christian, Judeo-Christian, Jewish perspective, what is the common ground with Muslims? Like, I know that these are the three forms of monotheism, but is it just as simple as Isaac and Ishmael, or are there more profound connections that Christians and Jewish people overlook?
So here's the thing that I think is the key. It's that all three religions came from the idea that we have to combat idolatry, that idolatry is really, really dangerous. And that's what the Bible came to do. And that's what the Christian scriptures came to do to some degree. And that's what the Quran came to do. They were all combating idolatry. In the time of the Hebrew, when the Hebrew scriptures came to be, the whole world was idolatrous. There was no monotheism. By the time what Paul did is to bring the Christian scriptures to the non-Jewish world, which all of it was idolatrous. And let's not forget what was going on in Arabia in the days before the Quran was out and out huge idolatry.
Right.
I mean, paganism. People would treat women as purely chattel property. Daughters would be killed. It was really an idolatrous world in Arabia, and the Quran came to overturn that too. Now, obviously, how things unfolded goes through all the complications of history.
Right.
But I think the key is is the getting rid of idolatry. And what my book did, and this is why I've had dialogues with Christians of all stripes, probably 80% of the readers and 80% of the people who I talk to about my book are Christian. But I've also had some dialogue with Muslims. It's a smaller percentage. And the one thing that they get is idolatry. And
right.
Why we need to come. And frankly, I think if we can go back to fighting idolatry, of which there's still too much, hopefully we'll get into this.
Right.
I think we could actually do a lot for putting all faith on a common platform.
Yeah. Allah and Jehovah, like, is when Muslims are worshiping Allah, is that just their name for Jehovah? And so we're worshiping Jehovah. They're worshiping Allah. Is it the same God?
It's the same God of Abraham. It is the same God of Abraham.
Now, was that like a qualifying statement of Abraham?
No, it's the God of Abraham.
Okay.
I mean, here's the thing, and you're a pastor, and you've also a pastor, so you'll remember this story of when Laban talks to Jacob when he goes after he chases him. And he says, let's make a blessing on the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, Abraham's
right.
father and
yep.
Laban's, their shared grandfather. And he says, no, I'm going to make a blessing on the God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac and God of my father Abraham. That's really where the definition of one almighty God started in this whole planet.
So can I say that we share some significant common ground amongst Christians, Jews, and Muslims?
Yes, and we've got sibling rivalry that unfortunately we also learn a lot about in the Bible,
right.
That to a certain degree has swamped some of those, some of our commonality. And that's why, again, I think we got to get back to figuring out what we're on this planet to do.
Right. All right. So I want to ask, I didn't know that you were Jewish, so I want to ask one question about that. Is when I think of Jews, like, I pretty much, it's as simple to me, and I would assume that it's not this simple, but for me, it's as simple as you guys don't see Jesus as God or the Messiah, and so are y'all still waiting for the Messiah? Like he's
Yes.
still to come? Okay.
Yes.
And
Jesus, from the perspective of Judaism, from the perspective of Jewish people, Jesus was a rabbi. I mean, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, he's the first person ever referred to as rabbi when he's referred to in the Christian scriptures. Because remember, there was Hillel and Shammai and all these folks who were Hebrew, Jewish sages. Well, if you just follow a timeline, nobody's calling anybody rabbi until the time of Jesus, and Jesus is referred to as rabbi. And then after that, we get Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi, Gamliel. We get all these rabbis. So he was in the line of being, from our perspective, a teacher, a preacher. But we, clearly have a different view with respect to his divinity.
Gotcha, for sure.
And we're still waiting for the Messiah, as our, Menachem Begin had a phrase that he said when he was welcoming a group of evangelical Christians to Jerusalem, and one of his aides said, they think that that the Messiah was Jesus and this and that, and he said, what does it matter? He said, when the Messiah actually comes, I'm going to raise my hand and ask him, have you been here already or not?
Yeah.
And then we'll know. But in the meantime, we don't.
Now, are you guys looking for a more human manifestation of the divine like Jesus was, or are you guys looking for a very obvious, this is the Son of God, and you can tell this is the Son of God? So,
in terms of the Messiah and the Messianic age, since there's the old story, 2 Jews, three opinions.
Yeah.
Different Jewish sages have different views about what the Messiah will be. They're all human-centered. They're all a descendant of David, of Jesse, and some sages think that we'll know. Some of our sages think that we'll absolutely know. It'll be clear and unmistakable, and others think we're going to have to learn that. I mean, we have a tradition that the Messiah can come at any time, and that there's some descendant who can come at any time, but we're not ready as humanity. We haven't hit that place that we're ready for the Messiah.
Gotcha. All right, so this is embarrassing for me. I've got to tell you something kind of silly, and you can help me with this and tell me if this is warranted reluctance on my part. For some reason, it doesn't feel right to say Jews. Like Jews, I always want to say Jewish people. Like when you say, "Oh, that guy's a Jew," oh, there's Jews over there. Is that not appropriate? For some reason, I just feel a little uneasy saying Jew.
Well, people say the Jews.
Yeah.
Or he, and in terms of talking to historical people, like, was Jesus a Jew? I think Jesus was, of course, a Jew.
Right.
But I think that there is, you're sort of right in that. I remember when I was in actually middle school, and I was walking down the street and someone would say, well, he's a Jew. I actually didn't think that was a compliment.
Yeah.
This is many years ago. So there's nothing technically wrong, I don't want to say, but I think it depends on the context.
Yeah. Gotcha. That makes sense. I mean, it's crazy. Like, have you ever seen the movie School Ties?
I haven't.
Yeah, I think you would.
I've been busy writing a book.
Yeah, I hear you.
Or 2 books.
It's an older movie, but when I saw it for the first time, I really was confused. I was just like, I don't understand the prejudice that people have against Jews. I don't get it. Like, I mean, obviously, I'm anti all racism, and I totally don't understand how people can't understand we all bleed red blood, but I at least can see how someone would be like, oh, okay, African Americans, they look different than me, and my grandpa was in the Klan, but what is the deal with racism towards Jewish people? Like, is it really like that people are mad because you guys crucified Jesus?
Well, First of all, I think some people believe that, and I'd say that was what the Catholic Church said for many millennium until Vatican II, and that's obviously cost a lot of people their lives, a lot of Jews their lives. I would say two things. Number one, I wrote the featured opinion piece in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I guess it's just over a year ago after the Tree of Life massacre. And I tried to explain what was different about anti-Semitism than other sorts of racism. All racism is bad, just like you said. Yeah. All racism is bad. But why? But here's what differs from anti-Semitism versus regular racism. Normal racism, you tend to denigrate the other people. Oh, that person is, has a different skin color. That person is an indigenous person. They're not as good as me. I mean, Voltaire famously said that Africans their feelings were what a trifling, that they weren't really human. Whereas Jews tend to be discriminated against whether they're rich or poor, whatever the situation, because Jews are somehow control the media, control the banks, control this, control that. They're responsible for all the evils in the world. And what's the reason for that? And here's what it comes back to. We're going to actually circle around in a funny kind of way. If you'll allow me to do a longish answer, it circles around to idolatry. Because what is idolatry? If you read the Bible casually, you'll think it's about maybe bowing down to idols. It's some magic making. It's this and that. But what is really idolatry? Idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing superpower or super authority to finite beings like you and me, individuals, ideologies, or natural processes. In the old days, it was also about worshiping animals. But we somehow think that we licked idolatry and the god king Pharaoh 3,300 years ago. But in reality, the whole 20th century was a catalog of modern idolatries. Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Hitler, the Assad family, the Kim family, and it goes on and on. How did Stalin starve a quarter of the Ukraine, kill all the kulaks, and send tens of millions to the gulag? And nobody questioned him. He said it, and they did it. It's because he had super authority. Because the religion, the super authority was communism. Right. He was the god king of communism. So you did what he said, just like Pharaoh. And he used the same friggin' tropes as Pharaoh. Poetry, pageantry, parades, pomp. All, of course, backed up by a strong army and secret informers, which is, again, exactly what Mao, Hitler, Mao caused the death of 75 million of his Chinese comrades. And he said that if 300 million would have died, that would have been okay. If it would have meant that the Communist Chinese Party, his God, took power. So what does that mean? That means that whenever you have forms of idolatry, one thing every idolater knows is that there could always be a more powerful God than his or her God. And so they want to kill that God and the way you kill God is kill God's people. And so for better, for worse, Jews have been associated, even secular Jews, associated with the Bible, with the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, as you would call it. And so people have this notion that you need to get rid of the Jews if your God, if your communist God is the primary God, if your Nazi God is the primary God. Jews tend to be a sort of a fly in that ointment. And so it doesn't matter Jewish status, whether they're rich or they're poor. My father, I don't know how deeply you got in my book, but my father was a Holocaust survivor. He was born in this place called Svendsen, Lithuania. and the Jews were maybe 25% of the town. They knew them people knew each other very well. Yet when the Nazis came in, there was, the local Christian villagers just stood around and watched them either be deported, murdered on the spot, and the like. And you would think, at the time, Lithuania was, everybody went to church. It was a very Catholic place, that's for sure. And not only did no one lift a hand, but when the Nazis got finished, and some of the local Lithuanians got finished murdering a good chunk of the Jewish community, people went around and took the gold out of their teeth and stole their possessions from their houses. So that's not a very monotheistic thing to do,
right?
But it is a thing to do if you believe, okay, I'm going to destroy this people, and then my God's stronger than their God. And that's the difference. I don't know if that's an answer you were looking for, but it's complicated, but it really goes back to ideology, and it's a sad thing.
Yeah. Gosh, it sure is. That's super interesting. All right. Our current culture, am I right to say that we are becoming more spiritual people, but simultaneously acquiring more of a disdain for monotheism and the organized spiritual approaches to spirituality, i.e. religion? Is that what things are looking like?
Here's what I think. I think everybody at a certain level is religious. The question is, and I think it's born in us, and you touched upon this in a past podcast, which is that everybody's looking for some sort of authority. The question is, are you going to be an idolater or a monotheist? Because everybody's looking, maybe not on a macro level of Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and those guys,
right?
Those evil guys, but we're looking for a leader who will tell us what to do. And then we can just park our brains at the door and do whatever our leader tells us to do, and we're good. And the reality is that spirituality can be fine, and having your own religion, not being part of organized religion can be fine, as long as you are a monotheist. Because monotheism, the way the Bible begins is that we're all brothers and sisters. That's the whole point of the Adam and Eve story. We're all brothers and sisters. We're not different. That's where the golden rule comes from. Don't do unto, as the way Hillel formulated it. It's in the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures. I like the Hillel's formulation the best, which is, don't do unto someone else what you wouldn't want done unto you. The rest is commentary. He said, go learn it. And if people are willing to do that, I'm good with them. Because that means you at least accept our common humanity. I would say maybe our common spark of godliness, the fact that we all have souls. But if you're just willing to live with the golden rule, I can make common cause with you. And if you're spiritual, great. And if you believe in one religion, great. If you believe in another religion, great. But we're good.
Yeah, for sure. So I've got my own thoughts about this, but I don't want my thoughts. I want your thoughts. So would you say that when you reflect on at least American Christianity, I'm assuming you would think that they go too far with the whole believer, unbeliever, saved, unsaved, Christian, pagan. It's like in or out sort of thing. So,
it's been one of the great things about book tours. I've got to meet Christians from Orthodox Christians, Greek, Russian, even to the mainstream to Catholics, to mainstream Protestants, to left. It's been an education for me. I've really enjoyed it. So look, I come from a tradition that says that what you do is the most important thing, how you conduct yourself, and in at least Hebrew Jewish tradition is that everybody can have a place in the world to come. It's a matter of how we comport ourselves on this planet. And so it's for us as Jews, it's not as much about belief as about being a good human being.
Yeah.
And that's sort of our take. And I know that differs. Some Christian groups, when I, say that, are totally good with that.
Right.
And others are not, in all candor.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So here's what I want to do. I want to come at you as an atheist. So I'm going to put on my atheist hat and try to think. And honestly, it's not too hard, because I would say a lot of questions and criticisms that atheists have, I've worked through the same things, and to some degree, some of them I haven't been able to work through, completely. So it's not that much of a long shot. A lot of questions I have as well. But let's just start right here. Of course, I'm not going to serve a God that orders the slaughter of women and children. Are you kidding me? Like, I don't even believe the Bible, but if the Bible is true, then I don't want to serve that God.
So what I'd like to do with you, I'm going to try to do it. It's going to take more than a few paragraphs. What I would really do with you, if I had time and you were a friend and we could sit down, I'd take you through all the biblical parts. So let me just start. Where does this all begin? It begins in chapter 14 of the Bible. When Abraham defeats the battle of the 4 kings, the 5 kings. Then Abraham comes in, if you remember, saves his family, saves his brother or his nephew Lot, and then the king of Melchizedek and the king of Sodom come to him, and they basically say, "Give us back the people; the rest is yours." From a figurative sense, Abraham has actually conquered the land at that point. But what does God say to him in the very next chapter? He says, and then Abraham gives it all back. What does God say after this figurative conquering of the land, metaphorical conquering, more than metaphorical? He's the big kahuna there. He says, know this. You're not going to possess this land now. You have to wait. Your descendants have to wait 400 years, because the iniquity of the locals isn't bad enough for them to be forced out of the land. Essentially, what God is saying is, I'm the global realtor. I get to assign who lives where, and your mortgage is moral behavior. So he says, no, well, you're going to have your children are going to have to be slaves in Egypt. So let's fast forward to the book of Numbers, where there's a lot of points. We call it Devarim in Hebrew. It's Bamidbar, actually. We call it Bamidbar in the wilderness, where there are commandments given to get rid of the 7 nations of Canaan. Right? What does it say, though? So now you're at the beginning of this 40-year journey, and this big public announcement has been made. When you go, all these 7 nations, get rid of them. But it doesn't say to murder them, every last person. What it does say is this: they have to leave. And indeed, if you read the Bible carefully, you'll find that the Girgashites are one of the 7 that are 7 nations, and you never hear from them again in the book. And according to Jewish tradition, they just picked up and left. They got the message. The Gibeonites and Joshua make a pact, even though it's a fraudulent pact, with the Israelites, and they let them stay too. This is in the book of Joshua. Rachav and her family, who helped the Israelites, who helped the 2 spies that come over, she and her family are saved too. Indeed, it seems like anybody who acts morally and becomes part of the community is saved. If you remember, when David goes to buy the threshing floor, which is where the Holy Temple is going to be built, what does it say? He buys it from the Jebusite. He could have just said, "Oh, you're a Jebusite. I'm going to kill you and take your property." But the Jebusite, if you read again, this is in Samuel 2, that person seems like a pretty moral person, and David doesn't say, "I'm just taking this from you." He doesn't understand the commandment that way. And then I'll give you one more thing. which is when the northern kingdom is about to be destroyed, and everyone either killed or deported, and the 10 tribes are gone forever. It says in Malachim, it says in the book of Kings, it says, well, 7,000 people aren't going to be deported because those are righteous people. So wherever you find the Bible talking about the conquest, and by the way, if the Jews aren't moral, they get kicked out too. Canaan has the land of it, the promised land has a high mortgage of living up to morality. So the only Jews that get to survive of the whole northern kingdom are these 7,000. The only Canaanites who get to survive are those who are moral. But by the way, anybody who leaves, and Rehav says this, everybody knows this is going to happen. Anybody who chooses to leave, there is no commandment to go in a racist way to go track them down and kill them. They're out of the land. Not my problem.
So the killing is basically for those that refuse to leave?
Yes. And I think a careful reading of the text says that. Only if you refuse to leave. But if you want to get out of Dodge, you're fine. Just get out of Dodge. Because God said it.
Yeah, I can still understand, and even myself, it's still difficult. Thinking of, a mom embracing her child and say, we're not leaving, and then them getting killed, it's still tough thing to wrap your mind around. But that's
or become a moral person, join up in that case with the people who are moral people like Rehav, who Jewish tradition has it that she married Joshua. And meanwhile, she's a prostitute in Jericho. To clear that you are not part of this group that was sacrificing children. Let's not forget how bad these people were. It was a pretty collective, there was a lot of collective evil going on. And I think even archaeology certainly will verify that. There was a lot of human sacrifice. After the Israelite conquest, there wasn't human sacrifice. There was a lot of bad stuff going on.
Yeah.
So if you want to cling to your child and say, I want to cling to these immoral ways, that's one thing. If you want to cling to your child and say, we're going to believe in one God, not in Molech or in, all of these other gods, Asherah, or whoever were the local gods, you could still manage to do it. The Gibeonites did it. The whole group essentially semi-converted.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know if this is even knowable, but back then, when all this stuff that we're talking about was going on, what did people think about the afterlife? Like when Canaanites were slaughtered, for instance. There doesn't seem to be like a concept of eternal conscious torment where, all these bad people go. Did they just believe that they were done, gone, dust?
Right.
Was there a belief in the afterlife?
So first of all, I just want to say for anybody who's listening, who's got a copy of my book, that I basically give in chapter 7 of my book, a longer form of the answer where I cite verse after verse where I, in a close reading that the Bible is not talking about genocide. It's talking about basically this people that has done such evil as God said to Abraham they were likely to do, that they deserve to be evicted from the promised land, from God's land. So the second question, though, in terms of an afterlife, we don't have in the Jewish world or in the Hebrew scriptures that concept of eternal, sort of the same sort of necessarily eternal damnation, except for people who really deserve it. So there are some who really deserve it, and they get it. And the Hitlers, the Pharaohs, there's been a whole host of evil people in the world. I don't need to I won't be able to even begin the list. But it's much more vague, and the Jewish tradition is much more focused on what you do in this world. And there's clearly a belief in the afterlife. I mean, the Bible says it a number of times that people were collected up to their forefathers or their ancestors, and there is a sense of that. And in the prophets, there's a very strong sense of an afterlife. But what it is pretty vague.
Yeah,
I have to say. Christianity filled that in.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that you keep saying, as far as Jewish people's concerned, it's like what you do and how you steward your life and everything. For Christians, it seems as if Jesus came, changed all of that. Like, for example, even your comment about someone like Hitler deserving that, totally get it, obviously, as a fellow human being, totally resonate with you. But I could see, I've heard of Christians saying, wouldn't it be a beautiful picture to see Hitler repenting in heaven with Israel surrounding him, praying for him? And it seems like because of Christians ascribing to the teachings of Jesus and, whoever believes in me, and then Paul comes along and, explains justification through faith and all of that, seems like Christians are tracking a different way than what we do. Like, I think we believe that our actions are for sure important and we need to be good stewards of life, but it doesn't really dictate what happens to us or, whether we're righteous or unrighteous. Does that make sense?
Well, look, I'm the son of a Holocaust survivor. My father was, when he was liberated, he was 60 pounds. And his family, his father was was murdered before they left Svendsen. Before he left Svendsen, his brothers were murdered, his uncles were murdered, his aunts were murdered, his cousins were murdered. There were only two other people he knows that got out of Svendsen that were his personal friends. A few others did. But, when the Nazis came to Svendsen, there's eyewitness accounts, not of my father because he was already deported, of Nazis taking pregnant women, cutting off their arms, then cutting open their wombs, and then letting them live. And in some cases, there's even one account, and this is an eyewitness account, again, of them putting a cat in her womb. I mean, it's very hard to forgive people for something like that and to say, oh, they can, I'm sorry if I sound emotional on this, but it's my family. And
right.
It's, and it's hard to say that that person can be later celebrated in any way. That person, sometimes you do things and it's in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, where you cut yourself off. The Hebrew words is licharet. You cut yourself off. When you do something like that, that's so mindfully anti-human, anti-God, if you believe that other people have a spark of godliness in them, which I do, then you can do certain things to cut yourself off from humanity. So do I think Hitler is in whatever the lowest rung of hell is? I think so, and I hope so.
Yeah. All right, so let's look at the end of Judges, and I'll read it. It says, "So that is what the Benjamites did. While the young women were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them." I'm like, wait a second. God sent fire on Sodom and Gomorrah for lack of hospitality. Why isn't God pissed here?
So that's
it's like kidnapping women, making them your sex slave almost. I mean, that's what it seems like.
That's you read almost to the end of Judges, right?
Yeah.
Now read, I don't have it in front of me. Read the last lines of Judges.
All right.
It's the last. It's actually 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. A man would do whatever seemed proper in his eyes. That was a terrible statement of judgment against the Jews of that time. That was saying, you know what? You didn't have a king. You didn't have anybody watching over you. You didn't, God is saying, I thought just belief in me was enough. It ain't. So now, in addition to there being fear of God, you're going to have a fear of a human king too. And that's what the whole book of Samuel is about. I mean, Hannah, who starts the book of Samuel, it says that, in the beginning of the book of Samuel, it says that prophecy was rare in those days. You had a corrupt high priesthood. I mean, the Bible can't be more, if I could use the word damning, it can't be more negative about the Israelites of the time. So yes, it's pretty bad. But what people don't get about the Bible is that sometimes it's reporting things because they're bad. I mean, if 5,000 years from now people are reading the New York Times and they realize they're covering what's going on with the Uyghurs in China and how much ink is being given to the Uyghur detention camps in the Xinjiang region, it's not going to be because they think that the New York Times was in favor of it. It's because actually they were condemning it. And that's exactly what the end of the book of Joshua is doing. It's saying, how could people who got the Torah from Mount Sinai, got the Ten Commandments, be doing this? They're doing this because there was no king in Israel. And all the commentators say no king in Israel means no God in Israel. That's
Gotcha.
exactly, because that's the only king there was in those days.
Now, are you in Joshua or Judges? Just to make sure we're on
I'm
the
sorry,
same page.
Judges. Did
Okay,
I say
okay.
Joshua? I meant Judges. It's
Yes.
the last line of Judges.
Yeah, so, I mean, like Lot sleeping with his daughters, that's reported because that's sick and twisted.
That's repugnant.
right.
And
right.
that's and by the way, Lot, until Lot went off on his own, Lot looked like he would be the successor to Abraham, right?
Yeah,
He
his
goes,
name's Lot. His name's Lot, not Lot.
in Hebrew, yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying?
Yeah, I mean, look, he's the first potential successor to Abraham. It's Lot or Lot.
Yeah.
The second potential successor, which God says no to, is Eliezer, right? His steward. He says, make him, because there's, he's not the successor either. But the way you lose out in being a successor to Abraham is you do stuff like Lot did, which is maybe the first night he was drunk, but by the second night he knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And that's the last you hear of him.
Yeah.
He's lost. He gives up his moral leadership.
Yep. That's sick dude. Sick dude. All right, so hell is something that I would imagine you're going to come from a different angle, and I don't know what that angle is. For like, I as a Jew, I don't know how you see the afterlife, but I do know that, at least evangelicalism and Catholicism and a lot of these manifestations of Christianity that most people in America grew up with. They grew up with the concept of eternal conscious torment, of hell, and that just does not sit well with them. Now, I kind of am at a different place with that as far as how I see that, but I don't want to talk about that as much as, here we have a God that is creating billions and billions and billions of people, knowing that the vast majority of them are going to be idolaters and are going to suffer eternal damnation. Like what? That's like a very inefficient God at the very least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, first of all, I as I said, I don't believe that everybody can, and I'm speaking as a Jew, and I'm speaking as someone who's been raised from Jewish texts, but we don't have that same notion. We have the notion that if you live your life, we have the 7 Noahide laws that apply to everybody. Basically, it comes down to the golden rule.
Yeah,
and if you do that, you can have a place in the world to come. But what the Bible really says, and the way we take it, and the way we take it in the most personal way, is that our lives are tests. We all have some mission on this planet to do, to make this place a little better. And we can either take up that mission or spend our time doing nothing or doing bad stuff. And if we do bad stuff, we might get punished, and depending on how bad it is, that punishment is appropriate. From our perspective, there's no magic way of belief to get out. There's no way of belief. I don't want to call it magic, but there's no way of belief to get us out of that. It has to be that our belief translates into action. And if our belief isn't strong enough that it translates into good action, then we really don't have belief, if that's making any sense to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so this one, I would say for me, really is something that has been puzzling, and I have read some of Pete N's work, and some of the stuff that he's written about this has been helpful, but the similarities between ancient stories of floods,
mm-hmm.
the similarities of different ancient civilizations of their law, to the law that we find in the Bible, it just starts to appear that the we'll just stick with the Torah. It seems like it's not that unique. So who's to say we're serving the one true God, and or doesn't it seem a little crazy that the stuff that we're reading is very common in other civilizations, and what does that say about us?
Right. Well, so I just want to point out to people, since you're asking me the questions atheists would say, I did a debate with this fellow by the name of Michael Shermer, who you probably heard of, who's a big name, who's a big atheist. So we went over some of these questions, and he didn't have to play an atheist. He is an atheist,
right.
Gladly and cheerfully. So look, I just want to say to you, and I'm going to give you an answer to your question, but I want to say there's a longer form answer to the question, because this is a lot of them. My book came to, and we can talk about generally what's in my book at some point.
Yeah.
But if you go to if you go to the section 4, I'm just opening up section 4, and you read chapters 20 through 24, I get to all of these issues.
Yeah.
Because my point is if the Torah, if the 5 books of Moses, if the Hebrew scriptures were just some texts written by shepherds with too much time on their hands, or ancient Israelite returning priests from Persia, then why should we give it any moral authority? And if they were just syncretizing, using books that were already in existence.
Right.
And so here's the thing. And again, I'm going to give you a short form answer to a really big question. You're hitting, I would say this to you, Joey, you're hitting a lot of the major questions that atheists ask me about.
I make a good atheist. I don't know if that's good.
Yeah, I don't know. It's two-edged sword. But so here's the thing. The Bible, first of all, was quite aware of all of these stories. There's no question about it. And just to take the easiest one first, because it is easy, if you look at the laws, the Hammurabi Code and the other laws, and you compare with the Bible is dramatically different. I mean, yes, there are a few commonalities, but you could, under the Hammurabi Code, murder someone, and it's okay if that person was of a lower social group. You could murder your wife because your wife was chattel. You could pay ransom, which was common, by the way, as well in Arabia. It's one of the things the Quran came to fix too. If you killed somebody, you can say, okay, that's Shmagegi. He wasn't really so good. Here's some money. Go away. It's only the Bible that says you can't kill anybody, man, woman, child, slave, without being guilty of murder, period. It's the only one. It's the only book that first came to say that these were overriding global principles. And when you look at fair weights and measures, again, that applied universally. And there's a tradition. It says it actually not just a tradition, but it's in the Bible. Every man and woman accepted the giving of the 10 Commandments. So this wasn't that it was done for, to some specific groups, to the elites. It was to everybody. So in terms of similarity to actual legal codes, you can sit down and yes, you can find some things that are similar because yes, they lived in the same world, but all of the overriding moral issues, no, the Bible's really, really different. No question about it. So that's something that's sort of one of those issues that people take who don't really delve into what the ancient legal codes were. If you do, you don't make that statement.
Yeah.
The second, which is, what about these stories? Wasn't there a flood story? Well, again, the Bible's aware of these stories to a great degree, and the Bible's aware of other creation stories. So, for example, some of the Hebrew words like tehom, which means the void or the nothingness, where actually the Hebrew is playing off of names of these other gods, names of these other creatures. I mean, the whole point is that of why does the Bible mention the one specific creature it mentions in the whole first chapter is the sea monsters? Because there were traditions of these things called the Tninim being involved with the creation of the world. So the Bible's making the point, this is just one of the creatures that God created. The Tehom, you call that a god? No, I'm just calling it the void. That's just a material that I'm using. There is no other creation story where God effortlessly creates the universe from just his utterances. I think Christians call logos to a great degree.
Right.
Just the pure, effortless creation. I mean, you don't have turtles. You don't have. I mean, the Greek legend is that Zeus created. Zeus killed his father, raped Hera. And from that, the world was created. I mean, there are all these really bloody, anthropomorphic creations of the world that don't really have any sense in morality. There's no moral purpose to the world. Here, from the very beginning, God created the world and gave everybody a spark of divinity, gave human beings a soul, created B'Tselem Elohim in the image of God. Very different. So if you actually get into the words, the Hebrew words, many times they're actually ridiculing the Aramaic or the other words or words for gods in the ancient languages by subsuming them. The same thing, frankly, happens in a number of the flood stories. Why in some of these flood stories is humanity wiped out? Because either there was the gods got bored. The gods thought that in one case the humans were making too much noise. There's no morality where it says that human beings are corrupting the earth. I mean, I actually wrote an article with my daughter about Noah warns us about climate change.
Yeah.
There's a sense that actually the evil that is happening, if you follow the Hebrew words closely, is actually corrupting the earth itself. It's polluting the earth. And so the whole take is that the Bible is playing with many of these ideas, but putting them on a moral standing, because the Bible's well aware of these myths. Otherwise, it wouldn't it wouldn't subsume some of those same words in its actual text.
So do you see the flood and the account of Noah as real history?
I say in my book that I think the first 11 chapters of the Bible cry out to be understood allegorically.
Yeah.
And, you don't have to take my word and say, he's a modern apologist.
Right.
If you look at some of the ancient thinkers who were reading the Bible, right, and they were way before there was any modern day physics, or we had, even telescopes. If you look at Rabbi Yitzchak of Akko, he was living in Svat in the 10th, 12th, 13th century, and he said that in the 13th century, I wanted to check. He was in Svat in the 13th century, and he said the world was created 15.3 billion years ago. How did he get to that? Well, I go through that in the book. If for people who are interested in it, I go through his calculation. But he's doing a very close reading of the Bible. And if you don't want to and the Ramban says the same thing. The universe, the Nachmani says the same thing. But look, even Muslim scholars like Ibn Sina and Ibn al-Safa say the same thing. Origen of Alexandria, Augustine of Hippo, all say the same thing. They say the world was created billions. We don't know. They didn't know what billions even meant, but they either said billions or they said a long, long time ago. Because look, you have points where the text is saying that Adam and Eve have two children, two sons. They get into a fight. One kills the other. What does Cain do? He goes and he marries someone and forms a city. How does that happen? Right? If you only have one remaining person left. I mean, there are plenty of hints in the Torah, I think, in the Noah story, too. Not to take this literally. These are not myths. They are stories that have tremendous, tremendous importance because, again, having us all be the descendants of Adam and Eve mean that we all share that you're my brother and I have to worry about you the same way that Cain and Abel, shouldn't have fought to the death.
Right.
I shouldn't be fighting with you because you have a spark of divinity, as do I. And that's what the Bible's getting at. And the Bible's getting at it, I think, in Noah, in the story of Noah too. Again, a close reading will come up with a number of points, just the same, just as I made, which is the Bible's saying, look, these are really, really important stories. Pay careful attention to them. The Tower of Babel story, I mean, basically there's three creation stories in the Bible. First, you've got Adam and Eve. Then you've got this Noah and the recreation of the world. And then you've got the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And they all have really important moral things to say to us. Very different than the ancients who were idolaters.
Yeah. Gotcha. So this one is kind of, I don't know. I think there's probably other people who have thought along these lines, but, maybe not quite like this. Why wouldn't, so, it says in this is New Testament, it says in Romans 1 that, creation basically makes clear that there is a God. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I mean, the intricacies of the cell and, the vastness of the universe and all of that, but still, that doesn't prove God. And you've got so many people that are missing out on having a relationship with God. And, I've talked to a lot of atheists, and a lot of them they're coming from a posture of, look, I'd love to believe. Like, I'm not being rebellious. Like, please try to convince me that there's this God that loves me. I would love that. I would love to know that there's hope and, that sort of thing. But there's so many people that they're having a hard time being convinced, and I don't think that they're putting on. It seems like that is really where they're coming from. So I thought before, like, why wouldn't God just make things just so much clearer? Like, what if every single month, he just did something crazy in the sky and like spoke a thunderous voice saying, I am God, I am creator, and I am real, and I love you, or or Jesus. I'll
doesn't matter.
Yeah,
whatever you want to say. I get the point.
Yeah, you get the point. Like, why not just make it so clear and obvious? Like, it just seems like it's kind of, you got to seek pretty hard to get to a place if you're kind of skeptical.
So it goes a little bit back to what I was saying before, which is this world is a test for us and how we behave. So let's say that you're a good person and I'm a bad person.
Okay.
And every month on the third Thursday of the month, God comes and makes a show over Manhattan or over wherever in the world, so it's broadcast everywhere, and this is the God show. There will be no doubt in your mind that there's God, nor will be there doubt in my mind. If every time I keep kosher, if I went out and ate a cheeseburger, which is not kosher, milk and meat, and a lightning bolt struck me down, you know what? There would be no test. I would have no choice. You and I, in this hypothetical, I'm the bad person, you're the good person. We would conduct our lives identically because we don't want to get struck down with a lightning bolt. If God's up there doing a big God show, and I know for certain that there's a God, and everybody knows for certain, well, to a certain degree, we're going to be deprived of our humanity. We become like angels, but except angels who do things purely out of fear. We may as well be, unfortunately, in the opposite way, we may as well be animals, or we may as well be anything. We'll no longer be humans. We'll be people who there is no test. And for whatever reason, and it's way beyond what I can figure out, God put us here to see what we do. The first people he put here, and that's part of the allegory, the first people he put here, Adam and Eve, he gave them one rule. They couldn't keep that one rule.
Yeah.
And he gave the Israelites some rules. They couldn't keep those rules, so they got punished. But they had free will. I mean, my father.
So we become robots by just
yes.
like if we knew, and I mean it was just clear to everybody. I don't know why that makes us a robot, because we could still at that point say, yeah, I see that you're God, but I want to do my own thing. I'm not listening to anybody. Like it seems like you could still make a choice.
There would be some, but 99% of the people who are rational would say, whoa, if I'm going to have a life and I'm going to be punished for anything wrong I do, then, and I'm certain of it, well, they'd live their life according to the rule book, whether they thought it was good or bad or indifferent. They would become robotic. And that's essentially our humanity. We have free will, whether we like it or not. And in order to maintain our free will, God needs to remain somewhat hidden. I don't think God is totally hidden. Right. I think God is somewhat hidden, because I think we get hints of God in many, many ways. I certainly see hints of God. But certainly with a light show every month would deprive us of our humanity.
Gosh,
it's not an easy thing, because you're getting to the point, which is actually in my book tour, when I do have encounters with atheists, the thing that seems to bother them the most is how, and I get this question one form or another, how can you believe in an all good God with so much bad stuff? I mean, if they've read my book, and so many people when I go to these book talks they'll say, well, your father was a Holocaust survivor. How do you square 6 million Jews being murdered? I don't even tell the stories. I gave you one story. You don't even have to tell people those stories. How do you square Hitler and the Nazi regime with an all-good God? Why didn't God all-powerful, omnipotent, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God? God could have killed Hitler. It wouldn't even been an exertion, right? How did God let Hitler live? And that's the question that is so hard for atheists, because I have to tell you, I talk to atheists and I go through the whole science, through evolution thing. It's in section 3 of my book. I go through a lot of this, and some of them will say, "Oh, I get it, but I can't believe in that God you believe in because he lets all this stuff happen." And there's more than disbelief. Many times from the part of atheists, I get anger, and I get the anger. Yeah, I get the anger. I'll tell you one more little story from my father. I wasn't anticipating saying this exact story, but this is something that I learned from him, and he took it in a different direction. So my father was deported in the first deportation from Svendsen. And I think I mentioned he was 60 pounds when he was liberated. He was probably hours from death. He was so fortunate he was liberated by the American forces, and he was so fortunate he was liberated toward the end. Dachau was liberated 3 months after Auschwitz, so they already knew you couldn't just feed, people who were leaving the concentration camps because they would die. They would go into insulin shock. Their intestines couldn't take it. So the U.S. Army put him in a hospital and nursed him back to health over many, many months.
Wow.
And my father made it to Chicago, got married, had a son, me, and he was really well aware that the only way that he survived was through a gazillion miracles. I mean, if you were holding that microphone in the other hand, I mean, that's how small the miracles needed to be. He'd be dead, right? I could take you through some of these stories. He'd be dead. So many tiny, tiny miracles happened that got him from Svendsen to being alive in Chicago. But yet at the same time, as he was grateful for the miracles, he was pretty angry at God because of what happened to his father, his brothers, his aunts, his uncles, his cousins, his friends. I mean, two people that he knew from Svendsen that he was with remained alive. And so my father would go to synagogue, but I didn't realize this until later. He'd go to synagogue. He would sort of sit through chat with people during the prayers. He'd doze off during the sermon. He'd go for the kiddush, the collation afterward, but he would never pray. I mean, he made sure that his son, me, was bar mitzvahed, that he made donations to the synagogue, that there was a place for Jews to go, a community, but he wouldn't pray. And it took me a long time to figure this out, but the reason is because he was giving God the silent treatment. He was really angry at God. He knew with certainty that there was a God in his mind because it got him. God got him, to Chicago.
Yeah,
but he was angry. That's a different way of taking anger.
Yeah,
it's a very different way.
It's almost like if you really love your parent, but you love your siblings, but your parent really favors you. You're like, I don't want that. Don't give me that. I love my siblings. I want you to love us all the same.
Yeah, it's yeah, and it impacted him his whole life, obviously.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it impacted me, generationally. I mean, I still sort of feel what. I mean, I didn't go through God forbid. I mean, my father was a tremendously greater man than me from what he survived. Tremendously great. I'm not like his small finger on one arm.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, as Gentiles, we have many times of being hard-headed, but it seems like the Jewish folks were super hard-headed, and this is what it reminds me, when we were talking about why didn't God just come and prove himself. I've thought about this before. It seems like that's what God was doing in the Old Testament with Moses. And I mean, it was just clear. He's turning a staff into a snake and opening up the Red Sea. And, I don't know if you see those as allegorical or actual history.
Actual history miracles. After chapter 11, I view the Bible as history.
Yeah. So it's like after all that, and they're going to make a daggum golden calf.
Yeah. Isn't that really bad? I mean, Isn't that so? As a Jew, I read that and I'm ready to cry.
Yeah.
I'm literally ready to cry.
Yeah, it doesn't even make sense. And so that clues me in on, it seems all good and it seems like a perfect formula for God just to reveal himself in some crazy way weekly, but maybe people would get used to that and just be like, I don't care about that being. Well,
so part of it is, and again, this goes to a deep reading of the Bible, is that you hit the nail on the head. Is that a lot of the big live miracles didn't have lasting impact. What ends up having lasting impact is how people behave. If you read the Bible, it's changing behaviors, because the people, when they made the golden calf, and there's the tradition is that they actually thought of it as somehow intercessor, some sort of intercessory sort of thing, because they call it the God of Israel that took, and it's hard to even, repeat the words. It took us out of Egypt. It's so hard to, understand that, but it also says how deeply ingrained idolatry was into them. The thing that we've learned, I think, as Jews reading the Bible again and again, is that the problem was that God was able to take the Jews out of Egypt, but he couldn't take the Egypt out of the Jews.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that generation had to die out because it couldn't merit going, just like I was saying how bad the people were in the promised land and how they needed to be wiped out. Well, those people couldn't have survived a day. The people that came out of Egypt couldn't have survived a day in the promised land because they didn't have the morality to stay in the promised land. They didn't. They had to stay in the wilderness.
Right.
And it is sad. And it does make me, every time I read that, want to cry.
Right. Right. All right. So I'll end it here, and then I want to give you an opportunity to touch on anything that I haven't brought up that you think, this interview would maybe be incomplete without. But
sure.
So looking at science in general, this is something that it just doesn't trip me up because I'm like, I'm not reading the Bible as a science textbook, so I'm not looking at it for scientific fact and all of that. But if, what would you say to an extremely insightful, brilliant, science-minded individual that just says, look, I just can't give the Bible even a second thought, given just how primitive that outlook is. And it seems like if it's coming from an inspired, if God is inspiring and speaking through these people, it seems like it would be correct information. Well, that's not correct information. We know that through science.
Well, first of all, so that's what my whole section 3 of the book is about. And when we finish, I'll give an overview of the book, which is the easiest section for me to write, and the section I wrote the fastest was science in the Bible. And I basically divided into 2 points: the creation of the world and evolution. And I have to tell you, neither are really great, huge barriers for belief in the Bible at all, or belief in. They're really not. If God 3,300 years ago would have given us, here's a set of quantum mechanic equations, and here's the theory of relativity, we wouldn't have even known what to do with that. God is writing to people in a way that I think is consistent for what they can accept. And if you read it again and you read it carefully, nobody thought exactly what God said was, not nobody, but very few thought that was exactly what it is. As I told you, Rabbi Yitzchak Kavako said the world was created 15.3 billion years ago. He almost nailed it by his close reading of the Bible. I'm just like, I wish the guy were around so I could give him a high five and say, you nailed it, dude. Right. And the same goes for evolution. I go through those in the book. They're not, the alternative theories that the atheists have, that live in the multiverse. They say, I've heard, atheists say this to me, is that, how wasteful of a God that we live on this insignificant planet, an insignificant sector, and an insignificant quadrant of the universe, and an insignificant galaxy that's in a one little tiny parsec of the universe. And then they say, but we have this better theory that's called the multiverse. And if you do the math, with the number of universes that would need to be created, just using 6 constants, forget that there's probably more like 24 or 30 constants, just take 6 and say, in order to have a set of rules that would allow a universe to exist that could theoretically support life, you get to about 10 to the 140. Now, just to give you an idea of so you and I have about 10 to the 28 atoms in our body. The universe has 10 to the 78th atoms in the whole universe. That's how, logarithmic works, right? It's 10 to every power is 10. That's the whole universe. The whole the number of multiverses that have to be around is 10 to the 140, which is a number so big I can't even imagine it. And that actually grossly understates our odds, because the initial conditions of the universe would have to be such. And Larry Krauss has this idea that there was a quantum flux in the nothingness, which, boy, if you want to believe in a fantasy, read A Universe from Nothingness by Lawrence Krauss. Actually, Don't read it. You can read a summary. And although I like authors, obviously being one, but there's not anything there. So when people say, how can I believe in a God that created the universe? I say, well, the alternative is something so super duper unlikely that if you just believe in Occam's razor, you get to some sort of creator. And it's actually very hard not to. Now, is it possible that we just happen to be in 1 over 10 to the 140th universes? It is.
Yeah.
Is it, is that some sort of disproof of God? Absolutely not.
Right.
And I tell people, look, part of the idea of hiddenness is that you can never come up with a pure proof of God or a pure disproof of God. Yeah. It just doesn't. It's not in the deck of cards that we've been dealt.
I mean, with some of that stuff though that you're saying, would you agree relatively with this statement? Like, if you're a bright scientist and you're looking at all the evidence and you still deny the possibility of God, you're just kind of being dishonest, or you have an agenda.
I think to some degree. Look, and I think in academia, it's very hard to be a believer these days.
Yeah.
But even with that, surveys of scientists show that at least half of all scientists are believers, and there are plenty of Nobel Prize winners. Paul Dirac, who's probably one of the greatest physicists, right after Einstein ever. He thought there was, that the universe was, it was very difficult for him to believe that the universe couldn't have a creator.
Yeah.
The laws of physics, a lot of things that have allowed life, very difficult. Is it impossible? No, because again, I don't think there can be any proof of God or disproof. And I go through this in section 3.
Yeah.
So that may be a good lead-in for me to give just a general overview of the book, so that people at least know what I'm doing.
For sure. And I'm looking at it. I'm looking at your book on Amazon, In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism. Religion can be both inspiring and distressing, and many critics of it are simultaneously compelling and dubious. And Scott Shay examines atheist arguments with a refreshing modern eye in this comprehensive look at our most fundamental questions about faith and reason.
Thank you. Yeah. So, and you can also see, by the way, in the Amazon, I've had plenty of folks from, all three, from the right, the left, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, endorsed, and I had some atheists read the book. Yeah. And they don't necessarily agree with me, but they got
to respect it.
They do.
They got to respect it.
So, and I've hopefully given some people doubts about their doubts.
Yeah.
So the book is divided into 6 sections. The first one is, what is idolatry? It gets into what we were talking about. What did the Bible come to do? Which is to overturn idolatry. The second section is on a number of questions like you raised. Is the good book good? Is the Bible and genocide, the Bible on the death penalty, the biblical inequality, monotheism and violence, Bible, and of course in modern freedom and the like. And then the third section is what I said, the section of, is religion useless, or is God evil, which is what a lot of atheists believe. And atheists tell us it's one or the other, and I obviously don't believe that, but it's how understanding good and evil and the like. The fourth section is on, does science make our belief in God irrational? Spoiler alert, I don't think so. The fifth section is the Bible a hoax? Was it made up? Is it, just some propaganda? And then the sixth section, and one that is changed for me in many ways is trying to think about what faith is and prayer. Because the atheists actually have a good time ridiculing prayer in their books.
Right.
And I think prayer is so important. And I think that unfortunately, we spend too much time on hymnals and on fixed liturgy that we lose track of that. But for me, prayer is the one thing in writing this book that changed the most for me was how I pray on a really deeply personal basis. And then I would say the other thing I would say is that to your listeners is that if they want to listen to me, went to Google and did a Google Book Talk where mostly the folks were people who are not believers, who believe reason is enough. It was a very interesting day. I took some questions. Loved being at Google. They have like the best food hall in the world, and it's all free. And I debated Michael Shermer. I've had all sorts of encounters with mostly, I'd say 80% Christian, as I said. That's all on the website. And I just unveiled something, which the good news is the first printing of my book has sold out. And we're doing a new printing, and I'm doing a promo right now that if you go to my webpage, scottshay.com/podcast promo, you can actually order the book and get 20% off because we have, some fresh new books. And so I'm really happy about that. Book is also available for a lot of people really like the audio version. And the good news is it's not me reading it. It's somebody with a much more pleasant voice who I really like. And you can listen to him for the whole book. He's really good. I've had a lot of people actually email me that they thought he had a very pleasant voice on their rides to and from work.
Yeah. That's important if you're going to listen to someone read a book.
Yeah. Andrew Todeless is his name. He's if anybody out there is an author thinking about someone to read his book, he was great.
That's awesome. Scott, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate your time and schooling us on a lot of good stuff, man. People are going to enjoy this. So thank you, and I'm going to sign off and say I best wishes to all of your listeners, and I hope they find my book engaging. I will say one other thing, just to finish. If people do want to contact me on the website, there's a form, and if they do, if you ask a question, I try to answer questions, but I ask people to keep it short. I've had some people write me chapter length emails. I can't respond to those. I just can't. So don't send me that because I'm not going to. But if you send me a short question, I try to respond to emails.